Today on the program, the fallout from the Telstra ultimatum, where the company has to split voluntarily or be broken in two.
We believe it is possible to achieve a win-win outcome in the interests of Telstra, its shareholders and, more broadly, all Australians.
Joining me this morning on the program, the Shadow Communications Minister, Nick Minchin. Senator Minchin, thanks for your time.
My pleasure.
Is separation of the company into the wholesale and retail arms not the best outcome for consumers?
Well, this has never been Labor policy. What Labor announced yesterday was a very radical, different and I think risky policy which Labor has never previously advocated. They did not go to the last election saying they would break up Telstra. Most of the evidence around the world, and indeed from our own Productivity Commission, is that forcing the breakup of this company carries enormous cost and risk to telecommunications services in Australia. Now, I know Telstra, everybody loves to sort of hate Telstra, but the fact is it has 9 million customers in this country. It is the backbone of our telecommunications system, and this sort of gun-at-the-head approach which Labor has adopted is risky and is radical, is a complete change in direction by the government, and I think they've failed adequately to explain why they've taken this step and why they think this is going to help consumers. I don't think the evidence is in on that.
But competition, the competition regime in this sector has been dysfunctional for years. You must concede that. So surely putting it on a level playing field is a good start, putting the sector on a level playing field.
Well, I disagree with that. I mean, Telstra obviously was a government-owned monopoly for decades, and we have moved, I think, quite significantly and in a very fast way away from that situation. We now have what I think is a highly competitive telecommunications system, particularly in mobile, and there's been a massive transition to mobile where Telstra does not even have 50% of the market. I mean, obviously they own the fixed line copper network, and it's difficult to have competition in the fixed line network. Now, the complaint of its competitors, the Optuses and others, is they don't get fair treatment in access to that copper network. I think there are other ways that we can deal with that issue rather than actually physically break up the company in a way that costs enormous value to shareholders and is highly risky. And as I say, the Productivity Commission, the OECD and the evidence internationally is that it's a very risky step to break up the incumbent telco into two quite separate and physical arms. There is a lot of risk attached to that, and we simply don't know the consequences of doing it.
But 150 access disputes. There have been 150 access disputes in the last few years with Optus and other competitors wanting a more level playing field, greater and more equitable access. Surely that's a symptom of something which is, of a system which is sick.
Well, the competitors are always going to complain, frankly, about the
but more
basis,
so in this sector than others.
Well, it's because there is a lot of competition, a lot of competitors wanting to get access to the network. But I think there are ways of dealing with that, and Telstra, I think, under David Thodey, the new managing director, is wanting to come to the table on what they call equivalence and transparency, regulatory changes which can improve the situation, short of physically breaking up the company. Now, I mean, and I think we've got to see what the government motive is here. The government has dug itself a $43 billion hole with its national broadband network proposal. It knows that that extraordinary and expensive policy can't work without Telstra. Now, the only way they can bring Telstra to the table and in effect acquire the Telstra copper network is with what the announcement was yesterday. Yesterday's announcement was about shoring up this very dodgy NBN proposal of theirs by forcing Telstra to, in a sense, hand over their copper network to what will be a new government-owned monopoly. I stress monopoly, that all these Optuses and others will now have to gain access to. And I think they're being naive if they believe that the situation will be that much better. And consumers are going to inevitably pay more for access to the government-owned monopoly fibre network than they currently pay for copper.
So you won't support this in the Senate?
Well, look,
you won't be backing this in the Parliament?
There's a 150-page bill in there, and there's a lot in it that we think is worth consideration. But on this issue of forcing Telstra to break up its company...
It's the key issue.
It is the key issue. We have grave reservations. We've not made a final decision on it. We want to see what Telstra's response to this is. We've got a lot of questions we want to ask the government. We'll send this bill to a Senate inquiry and examine it in detail. But certainly, our prima facie view would be that forcing Telstra to break up the company is the wrong way to go.
You talk about the the damage to the shareholder interest. But under your watch, the Telstra shares fell dramatically. Sol Trujillo was appointed, and the Telstra share price fell substantially.
Well, with great respect, that's simply not true. When we left office at the end of 2007, the share price was $4.50. It is now $3.11. The collapse in the share price has all occurred under this regime of Kevin Rudd's.
But you were finance
minister. The share price
minister.
Collapse has occurred under Kevin Rudd.
But you were finance minister
$18
when
billion.
this company floated. And
I was responsible for T3.
That's
yes.
right. And well, when the initial share price was over $7 when the coalition was in power, and it fell to $4.50. That's a $3 drop.
No, I think it was around the $5 mark. I mean, the share price, like the whole stock market, has gone up and down. Telstra
but
isn't
it a bit rich, given that it fell so much during your watch, that you're putting the blame on the government over the share price issue?
But the share price of Telstra has tended to track the market. But there are two big things that have happened under Kevin Rudd and Stephen Conroy that have caused an $18 billion collapse in the value of Telstra and hurt mum and dad shareholders. They were, one, Telstra being excluded by this government from its first failed NBN tender, and where the share price collapsed, and then secondly, yesterday's announcement about breaking up the company. So the share price has gone from $4.50 to $3.11 under this government, a collapse of $18 billion in the value of those shares. I mean, it's like, the Labor Party wants Telstra shareholders to pay the price for the mess it's making of telecommunications. I mean, Labor said they were going to roll out new NBN services at the end of last year. We're now nearly at the end of 2009, 2 years after this government came to office, and we've seen nothing. No new broadband services, a $43 billion proposal which can't work without Telstra, and now we have this gun at the head of Telstra to try and save them from their failed policies.
So no regrets on your part in recommending mum and dad shareholders buy into Telstra?
Not at all. The privatisation of Telstra under us was one of the most successful privatisations in the world. It was extremely good. It brought more Australians into the share market, and they've all been receiving extremely good dividends from Telstra, which has been a well-run company. But regrettably, under Labor, they've seen $18 billion stripped from the value of the company.
OK, on a couple of other issues before I let you go. Yesterday in the Coalition Party Room, Brendan Nelson gave his valedictory to the party room. He's leaving Parliament, of course. A number of other MPs spoke in support of his position that the coalition should not negotiate with the government on the emissions trading scheme before Copenhagen. What is the coalition position? Is it to achieve a negotiated outcome?
Well, the Shadow Cabinet announced our position some weeks ago, and it remains the position that we believe it is quite reprehensible and wrong of the government to be seeking to legislate this emissions trading scheme prior to Copenhagen. That is the strong coalition position. We believe the government should wait until after Copenhagen. There is no need whatsoever to rush this through the Parliament before the Copenhagen meeting.
But there will be a vote before Copenhagen.
Well,
so what will the coalition do?
I'll go on to say that is our position. We have also said as a Shadow Cabinet that if the government, despite that, insists on bringing this bill back in November, we've set out 9 preconditions that the government would have to meet in terms of amendments to its bill before we'd be prepared to consider voting for it. So the onus is on the government to draft amendments and present amendments to the Senate that reflect those 9 preconditions for the improvements we think need to be made to the bill before we could consider supporting it.
But having been in that party room yesterday, that the strength of feeling about this legislation, any negotiated outcome with those amendments or otherwise, would not be acceptable to a lot of your party, a lot of your coalition. Well,
I read yesterday as a reaffirmation of the principal coalition position, and that is that there should be no legislation before Copenhagen. That's how I read yesterday. The Shadow Cabinet position is well known. We'll have to go back to the party room if there are any amendments from the government and put a recommendation to the party room, and that will depend on what the government puts on the table.
What's your feeling? Do you think there will be a negotiated outcome?
Well, I don't see any movement from the government. I think the government is so arrogant about all this that it's unlikely, in my view, that the government will come up with a sort of sets of amendments that would render it possible for us to support the bill. But if the government wants this legislation, the onus is on them to improve it, because it's a very damaging piece of legislation. It will see thousands of Australians lose their jobs and see the price of electricity increase for every Australian.
Today marks 1 year since Brendan Nelson was ousted from the leadership. He is leaving Parliament, as we've discussed. His valedictory is tonight to the Parliament. Was it all worth it when you look at the polls and you're basically where you were?
Well, look, I'm not going to go into the detail of that. Today is a day to celebrate Brendan Nelson's great career in politics. He's achieved as much as you can achieve in the Liberal Party, been a senior cabinet minister and our Liberal leader. I strongly supported him in both ballots, as you know, for leadership. I thought he did a really good job in very tough circumstances, and today we should celebrate a great career and a great contribution to Australia.
Nick Minchin, appreciate your time.
My pleasure.